Chapter 34. Hope Has Wings. It was mid-January 1993. I was at Lydd Airfield in Kent on a wet and windy day. I'd joined our MAF headquarters staff for the dedication of our latest plane. Jack Hemmings, still a keen pilot, had come over from his home nearby to view it too. It was good to see him again. The aircraft was a turbine-engined de Havilland Beaver, ready to be flown by a ferry pilot to Ethiopia. Ethiopia? Yes, MAF was going back to Ethiopia. Conditions there had begun to change. The worldwide backlash against communism, the demands for democracy, and the unwinnable civil war with Eritrea had all forced the Mengistu regime to declare that the country was no longer Marxist. By 1991, freedom of religion was proclaimed. A few months later, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front took control. Mengistu fled. Churches and missions asked us to return. At Max Gove's request, the Sycamores and later the Kurkulas went back to explore the situation. They were met with a universal welcome from the churches and missions, very different from the mixed reception Bob and Betty Hutchins had faced in Addis Ababa when they first went there in 1960. They brought back encouraging reports. They confirmed beyond question that all the earlier efforts had been worthwhile. In the highland regions north of Addis Ababa, we'd previously helped the Southern Baptist Mission start new work. Along with many other missions, they'd been obliged to leave in 1977. At that time, there were only 12 believers in the area. 13 years of persecution and problems followed. But during the severe famine of 1984, the mission had been invited to return and help in relief work. They found the number of believers had risen to 100. The work was still developing, and they looked forward to MAF's help again. In the southwest, where the American mission had worked among the Ethiopian Anuak, there were now 50 congregations, with Christians in all the major Anuak villages. Church leaders had grown in knowledge of the scriptures, left for them in their own language. One senior Anuak pastor claimed, "There is a great harvest now coming, as the Spirit of God moves among the Anuak people." The new freedom of religion enabled some of the missionaries to give them the further Bible and leadership training they hungered for. In other tribal areas, where the American mission had also worked with MAF's help, the church had continued to grow in numbers and spiritual depth. Among the Nuers, one small congregation now numbered over 900. Any group with fewer than 200 to 250 members was counted only as a beginning church. And what about the Majang? Harvey Hoekstra's work among them in the remote rainforest had depended greatly on the MAF air service. The church was still small when he was forced to leave, but as one of his fellow missionaries put it, this work out in the middle of nowhere grew and took off. Now, there were 3,000 Majang believers in more than 30 villages throughout the region. The church was full of enthusiasm. It had reached out to another nearby tribe, and already there were several hundred new Christians. "What is happening to these Majang people?" the merchants in the Tepe area had been asking. "They're no longer drinking themselves to death. They no longer kill each other. And when they're sick, they go off into the forest and pray to their God. And when they come out, they're no longer sick." Harvey's fellow missionary summed up, "We are thankful for all MAF did in the past. We are grateful. It is now coming back again." In 1965, we'd supported the Christian Missionary Fellowship when they began their work in remote areas 150 miles northwest of Addis Ababa. They'd also had satellite airstrips for outreach, and when they left, there were some 3,000 Christians. During the troubles that followed, the numbers, far from declining, rose to 10,000. As elsewhere, church leaders now wanted missionaries to start Bible teaching to strengthen the church further. Under the communist regime, many church buildings had been closed in places familiar to us all over Ethiopia. There had been much suffering and persecution. Nevertheless, the Christians had continued to meet, sometimes in the bush or forest, sometimes in houses. Thousands of small church groups had been formed. Now, church buildings had reopened in Addis Ababa and throughout the country. At one place in the south, when a church opened again, over 10,000 people arrived, and the first service lasted 4 days. As we planned for re-entry, we saw we'd need a bigger plane for Ethiopia than in the past. It would need to have a turbine engine, since fuel supplies were now hard to get for piston engine planes. When the turbine version of the Beaver was chosen, Max wrote to our prayer partners, "It's almost as if the plane had been especially designed for the rugged flying in Ethiopia." Its strong construction meant that it could survive the rough airstrips. Its simple design made it cheap to maintain. It could carry 10 people or a ton of urgent freight. The news that MAF was returning to Ethiopia brought an enthusiastic response from our supporters. Planes like the Beaver are not cheap, yet within a few weeks the money to buy it was there. Donors gave with generosity and sacrifice. One sent part of his redundancy payment, another the money set aside for a new carpet. A housewife sent the savings intended to buy a cooker. Many promised to pray for the new work. I soon learned more about the long-term results of the work in other areas where we'd been, areas where there was still pain and persecution. Some of the information came on the radio. At home on Easter Monday 1992, I turned on the BBC News. "This is the world at one. At the little town of Akobo in southern Sudan, 50,000 people are starving to death. They are refugees in the civil war in that country. United Nations planes had been providing food and medical aid to Akobo and the surrounding area, but permission for these flights was withdrawn by the Sudan government 3 weeks ago. 8,000 Christians at Akobo gathered to pray for help yesterday evening. Their prayers were answered. The government has now agreed that flights can be resumed. The first United Nations plane will go in again tomorrow." What had brought Akobo, that remote village, to the centre of world news, even for a few moments? Why were 50,000 people gathered there? Where had those 8,000 Christians come from? Almost exactly 42 years had passed since Jack Hemmings and I had first flown through cloud and rain from Malakal to Akobo, to be welcomed by Don McClure and his fellow missionaries. Jack and I, and later the Stephens, had seen the beginnings of the church there, the early river baptisms, the way the American mission had pioneered amongst the Nuer and the Anuak, bringing medical, agricultural, educational and spiritual help. We'd seen how those early missionaries had served, loved, laughed and identified with these remote Nilotic people. But MAF and missionaries alike had been forced to leave southern Sudan. Apart from the brief years of the peace accord, conflict between North and South Sudan had continued without remission ever since. Many of the Anuak, Nuer, and other tribes had fled across the border into Ethiopia to escape the fighting. The Ethiopian government allowed the United Nations to establish a camp for them at Etang, a tiny isolated spot in the hot lowland plains of southwestern Ethiopia. By 1990, it had become one of the world's largest refugee camps. More than 260,000 who had fled war, starvation, and even slavery in Sudan found some sort of security there. More kept arriving. Even this situation was soon to be disturbed. In May 1991, When the Marxist regime in Ethiopia was overthrown, the new administration decided to expel Sudanese anti-Khartoum rebels, and along with them, many innocent refugees at Etang. The already war-shocked Sudanese, now numbering 400,000, abandoned their settlement and fled back into their own still troubled country. Of those who survived travel through many miles of wet season swamp, many didn't. 50,000 poured into Akobo. As the BBC had announced, the United Nations and also the Red Cross were permitted to give some help at this point. Tons of food were flown in from Kenya to the starving populations at Akobo and Nasser. A cross was involved, and our own MAF planes were able to take part. Tuberculosis, hepatitis, Kala-Azar and the ever-present malaria were rampant. Medical care and feeding centres were set up, together with orphanages for the many children who had lost their parents in fighting and famine. Nigel Riley was one of our pilots helping the relief operations. He met newer Christians at Akobo, whom he'd known when based in Malakal 9 years previously. Though they'd been refugees in Ethiopia and Sudan, Nigel found that the number of Christians had grown greatly, and their churches now gathered with large congregations. They took a lead in organising the distressed communities, arranging the distribution of relief supplies with care and fairness. Nasser had been bombed almost to extinction by the northern government. Only one building in the town had been left, with more than 2 walls standing. But whereas when the missionaries had been expelled from there the church attendance was less than 100, it had now grown to almost 3,000. In the wider surrounding area, it had expanded nearly 10 times that number. Rather than being halted, the work of God had accelerated. Remember the Uduk? Mal and Enid Forsberg, Mary Beam and Betty Cridland and other early missionaries had worked painstakingly to translate the Bible for them and to bring them basic education and modern medicine. A small church had been established with its first Uduk pastor. I still recall the original airstrip we sighted among them at Shali al-Fil, and many subsequent flights in support of the missionaries and the church. Before the first expulsions, we'd flown in quantities of the newly printed Uduk scriptures. There were already hundreds of Christians when the mission departed, and their numbers continued to grow. 30 years later, there were 17 thriving churches. But Sudan's civil war reached the Uduk in 1987. Some were killed. Their villages, homes and churches were burned and pillaged. Together with some Maban and a few Dinka, they fled across the border to Asosa in Ethiopia. They arrived there destitute, with only what they could carry on their backs. But they hastened to re-establish their life and traditional structures. Teachers amongst them organised crude classrooms under grass roofs. They established churches for themselves and the Maban. The United Nations found their camp at Asosa a model of orderliness and gave the Uduk community the credit. They were attacked again, and their camp looted by Sudanese militia. Survivors had to flee once more into the bush. Many escaped southwards through Ethiopia's western mountains and reached Etang. As the newest arrivals at the already overloaded camp, they had to make do with the barest of benefits. But soon their churches were functioning again. They baptized more than 600 new Christians. When, like the rest of the refugees in Etang, they had to flee back to Sudan, 30,000 of them settled close to Nasser. The country was at its wettest. They crowded into a small dry area a few feet above the floods, surrounded by swamps. With scarcely room to walk between their little grass huts, they still left a number of empty circles, 20 yards in diameter. These were churches, clearings in the dirt, amid the heat and humidity under the open sky. There were 6 for the Uduk, 1 for the Maban. They called them places of prayer. Yet these churches were continuing to grow. There were over 160 Uduk attending baptismal classes, with others waiting to join future groups. They still had over 100 copies of the Scriptures. This in spite of being driven from their homes 3 times and walking hundreds of miles. The fact that any Bibles survived at all testified to the Uduk's respect and love for them, for each time they fled, they had had to carry their most cherished possessions on their backs, including their children. Still further south in the Sudan, other churches also were continuing to live through the horrors of civil war. In some regions, the situation, sadly, was aggravated by factional fighting within and among different tribes. Yet even in these circumstances, the churches experienced unprecedented growth. Hundreds of new worship songs were written amid the sorrows. Thousands became Christians. The spectres of famine and war in the Sudan continued and became blacker than ever. The suffering went on. There were reports of tens of thousands still fleeing or being killed and starved, of leaders being eliminated, villages destroyed, tribes and families broken up and forcibly moved in a determined drive to eradicate them. On the 8th of September 1992, the BBC World Service referred to the horrors again. A complete tribe in Sudan is in danger of extinction. The Uduk became Christians as a result of the teaching of missionaries, but they have been driven from their villages by militia. They now face starvation and extinction. It was a brief, lonely cry, mentioning only one of the Sudan's many suffering tribes. What was happening with other tribes and in other areas was happening to the Uduk. They were being forced to move and flee again. Many of them had already died. A week later, our MAF Europe board was meeting in Denmark. David Cormack had now become chairman. When evening came, we left our intensive discussions to join together with the Karlslund Strand Church for a time of worship, prayer, and Bible study. I had been asked to be the preacher. As I sat at the front, the young people in the music group were leading us in the opening worship. Some of the songs were in Danish, some in English. Suddenly, the young musicians started a song I'd not heard for many years. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back. The cross before me, the world behind me. No turning back, no turning back. In a flash, my mind went back to that fateful day when the missionaries had to leave the early Uduk church at Chalet el-Fil. The deep implications of those same words the Uduk had sung swept over me. I was almost overcome as I thought of all they had been through since. They had not wavered in their decision. Through all the horror, they'd held to their hope more strongly than ever. They had never turned back. I realized again, where men and women have accepted God's word, how much their lives have been changed. A living hope has been given them, a hope that even in hostile environments continues to grow. As Jack and I watched the Beaver taxi out on its way to Africa, we thought of another scene. That January day in 1948, almost exactly 45 years previously, when our little Gemini had taken off on our first long journey for MAF. The buffeting winds and drenching rain had symbolized the difficulties we were to face in the months and years ahead. Yet in spite of the problems, God had established and used the work of MAF. The Beaver took off and quickly disappeared into the low, misty clouds. It was going to a world of continuing and increasing needs, a world in which the Church still faces enormous challenges, but one in which, under God, hope still has wings. "There must be a beginning of any great matter," said Sir Francis Drake, "but the continuing unto the end, until it be thoroughly finished, yields the true glory. It is God who will see the work of MAF thoroughly finished, and the true glory belongs to Him."